Jai Hind and welcome to Dev Talks on News That Matters. A lot has happened within Europe, within America, within the rest of the world as an impact of the war in Ukraine. The gas prices have gone up, there are food shortages, there is crisis of trust around the world. Let's look and analyze the biggest newsmakers in the past some time, as I've been doing. Before I begin, request you to subscribe to my channel, like my videos, and yes, if you want to help me out, click the thanks button. Thank you in advance for your viewership. We know about the Gazprom issue that was taking place between Germany, Canada, and Russia, a triangle of sorts. There was a piece of machinery that was supposed to be repaired slash maintained, or whatever it was, supposed to be done by the Siemens company in Germany. This particular part was sent to Canada for repairs, and there was a bit of a tussle between Germany and Canada when the Canadians refused to supply back that particular piece of machinery. A couple of days ago, we had a news of the German economic minister, Robert Habeck, who mentioned, and I quote, with a heavy heart, he asked the Canadians to release the Siemens gas pumping units, which was stuck because of the sanctions. This took about more than 2 weeks for it to get sorted out, which probably could have been done over a call. Tells you what's happening within the Western world. One big question I'd like to ask here, and this is something I'd like all of you to analyze for yourself. I'm here to give you the news, the opinions you need to form. My question here is, will oil dominate the world geopolitics from now on? And this is something that we see happening with the oil bans coming in from Russia, alternative vendors or alternative uh, purchasers of oil that the Russians have been able to accumulate, and a whole crisis sort of a situation forming around in terms of oil and gas. One news that came out of the US, more than 5 million barrels of oil that were a part of the historic US emergency reserves were released to lower the domestic prices of oil within the states. Uh, this was basically released to be consumed domestically, but was actually exported to Europe, Asia, including India and China, according to data that was put out by the US itself. One of the things is funny is because the gasoline prices in US is really, really high, and which is affecting the standard of living and inflation and so on and so forth within the states. About 1 million barrels per day was released out of the Strategic Petroleum Reserves, or the SPR, as the USA calls it, through October onward, somewhere around that time. The flow is actually draining, and this is something which is coming out of the establishment in the USA, which talks about the flow has drained to a certain level which is below the SPR, or the Strategic Petroleum Reserves, which were held in 1986. And that's a matter of concern for the United States. The European Parliament, looking at the oil shortages, is now declaring nuclear power and, funnily, natural gas as green and sustainable energy sources. As I said, question is, will oil dominate the global geopolitics? These are just some facts that I'm telling you, and I'm much more facts which would emerge in future episodes as well, which will give you hints as to what the answer to this question is. Russia, Iran, and China are announcing joint military drills in Latin America. Post this, the Chinese, currently, actually, the Chinese and Pakistanis are holding drills in East China Sea. It's a bit of a funny thing when you see the Pakistanis and Chinese are holding drills in the East China Sea. They talk about interoperability and as per them, don't focus on a particular target. Let's believe that. The executive arm of the European Union is now blocking a 1.5 million euro loan for Ukraine as caution prevails over the country's urgent needs, according to the many officials within the European Commission. One of the things that we see is that till now there was free flow of money going into Ukraine. As a matter of fact, in the past day or so, about 2 billion more of aid has been approved by the United States to go into Ukraine. One must learn the numbers are big, but we really don't know what the aid actually consists of. This is sort of a catch 22 situation for the European Union, especially who's committed quite hard into the cause of Europe, into the cause of Ukraine, but it is now worried about Ukraine's financial reliability. And this was basically quoted by Bloomberg, who says that Ukraine might not be able to furnish the loans that are being taken by the country. Europe is actually facing through a big crisis. They are preparing for winters. Germany is talking about rationing hot water, dimming the street lights on a daily basis, shutting down swimming pools, reducing electricity consumptions, taking the temperatures up by about 2 degrees and so on and so forth. And it's quite amazing when we see such kind of steps being taken by the European Union. It is because this was expected to be pretty well planned. Having said that, what we now see is that there are farmer protests which are breaking out all over Europe, which started off in Netherlands and it spread to Germany, Poland, and many other countries within the European Union. Interestingly, these farmers' protests are being crushed with a very heavy hand. And we all remember the condemnation that India got when certain protests in certain areas were pushed back by the Indian authorities. When the shoe is on the other foot, is all I would say. There is a Biden, as a matter of fact, is traveling as we speak to the Middle East. He's supposed to land up in Israel, meet up with the Israeli officials, and then go into Palestine in the West Bank and fly into Saudi Arabia. One of the things that we see within this particular region, big news with regards to security, is the formation of an Arab NATO. This was an interesting news that came out about a month and a half ago. What is Arab NATO is something that one might want to ask. It talks about, whatever's there. I'm just going to tell you what is there in the public domain. It talks about Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, Egypt, Jordan, Sudan, Morocco, and, hold your breath, Israel being part of this military alliance. As a matter of fact, preparations seems to have kicked off as Israel and US are pushing the Arab countries for a joint air defense pact. This is being done with a focus towards Iran and countering its so-called nefarious designs within this region. This entire thing it seems to be a little hurried through, especially with the war in Ukraine and the US wanting to solidify its security standing within the particular region, especially considering the oil safety, as I mentioned. Coming back to the oil versus geopolitics question that I'd asked in the beginning of this episode. The G20 Foreign Ministers Summit ended a while ago in Bali. It was a bit off, as a matter of fact. It didn't seem like something very, very substantial came out of that G20 summit. And there was a funny incident that happened wherein when the foreign minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, gave his speech, and before any of the Western foreign ministers, including the Ukrainian one, could give his thoughts, Sergei Lavrov had already left the country. Another news coming out with regards oil in France is that fearing a shut-off of oil, and this is something, mind you, I'd like to mention here, a lot of the Europeans are scared of. They're talking about the so-called maintenance being done by the Gazprom for the next 10 days till the July 21st, a ruse being put across by the Russians to shut off oil supplies into Europe permanently. France, as I said, is taking steps to kind of switch from its gas into oil. That's something that they can get easily from Africa and America. France seems to be preparing to find an alternative in case the worst does happen. Bloomberg actually reported European gas prices are worse than they look. Shortages and price hikes will go on till 2024. And this is something that German industry leaders are also talking about now very openly, that this is going to be one of the worst times for German industries since 1990s. And we all see that the Germans have had a little bit of an economic setback on a month-on-month basis as of now. Let's hope and pray things don't go as far, because uh, economic recession and economic downturn seems right on the corner. I hope things do turn around, sense does prevail, and we jump out of it. Looking at this particular region, the India-China region, the SEO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, has had two new interested parties to join. One is Belarus and the second is Iran. Iran seems to be jumping on to any and every forum where the Chinese and the Russians are there. For example, they've also proposed to join the BRICS. Let's see how far this particular thing goes off. Talking about Iran, Putin would be visiting somewhere around the 18th or 19th of this month, where Putin is going to have a dialogue, a trilateral dialogue with the President Erdogan of Turkey, the Iranian leader, and himself with regards the so-called Astana peace process to end the war in Syria. I wonder how much of the Syrian war is going to get affected, especially with Turkey's designs of creating a buffer zone in the northern Syria close to the Turkish border. How this whole game will play out, especially again, Turkish approval of Sweden and NATO joining, Sweden and Finland joining NATO. How will the Putin-Erdogan relation, or how will the Putin-Erdogan equation go forward, is something that we will be interested to find out. Western sources, which are basically talking about the Iranians being ready to sell hundreds and hundreds of armed and unarmed drones to the Russians. Now, you may ask, the Russians are a supplier of arms to the rest of the world. How come the Iranians are selling these drones to them? Well, to tell you the truth, the Russians were a bit late to come inside the drone game, and the Iranians have had some successes with regards their own technology and reverse engineering some captured American drones and creating their own systems. Talking about the Middle East and the Afghanistan region, the Taliban and the United Arab Emirates are poised to strike a deal for the Gulf nation to run the Kabul International Airport and several other airports in Afghanistan. This deal could be announced in the next coming few weeks. It is quite interesting seeing UAE coming in, especially after the Indian footprint within Afghanistan kind of went up. And for the last segment in this particular episode, I'd like to give you an update on the war in Ukraine. We all know the town of Lysychansk has fallen, and the Russian forces, by the reports that I'm reading, are reconstituting their entire units. And I've also read reports about fresher, battle action groups coming in from Russia to counter and fill up certain places where the Russians feel there is a certain amount of vulnerability. This, mind you, is the last phase of the Ukraine Donbass war in the east, post the fall of Lysychansk. The next few cities, districts, towns which are left mainly is a town of Bakhmut, which is on a main highway connecting the north and south of Donbass. There's a town called Avdiivka, which is supposed to be a big supply sort of a base for the Ukrainian army, and the twin towns of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk in northern Donbass. One of the things is now coming out is that the Ukrainians have planned sort of a big counteroffensive in the southern regions to push and put some pressure on the Russians within that area. The southern parts are basically close to Crimea, and I'm sure the Russians would be looking at appropriate measures as to come across and stop this counteroffensive. Counteroffensives have been the name of the game for the Ukrainians for the past some time, and a lot many news articles and stories that come out of counteroffensives that have taken place in the north, in cities like Kharkiv, in cities in the south like Kherson and Zaporizhia. One of the interesting things that we see when you combine the news of Russian battle action groups being transported from Russia into the war theater, if you connect the dots, you kind of realize that there is some sort of a preparation which is already on to counter any sort of action that the Ukrainians would be taking. News that came out of the Ukraine, which talks about 700,000 to about 1 million strong army that the Ukrainians are trying to raise to start up a counteroffensive sometime in August. That seems to me at the moment being ratified even by the Russian side, who has put out certain confirmed articles, posts, reports about some sort of a concentration of Ukrainian troops close to the southern battle lines. The UK had offered, this was, I think, offered to the Ukrainians during the last visit of the erstwhile Prime Minister, or the current caretaker Prime Minister, if I may say, Boris Johnson, to the Ukrainians. And he had said that the UK would be ready to train about 10,000 soldiers of the Ukrainian army per month. How far and how much in terms of numbers would that make a difference is something that I would not like to comment on, as I'm not a military expert. Having said that, with the numbers that we see that are getting affected by this particular war, especially in the Ukrainian side, there was a report a couple of days ago when the Ukrainians themselves admitted to losing 500 men in a single day of action. Funnily speaking, Putin in his last speech actually gave sort of a rhetoric threat to the West, and he said, the West wanted to defeat the Russians on the battlefield, and he said, try it. And to top it off, he said, keep in mind, we haven't even started anything serious yet. Now that could be construed as a big threat, could be construed as overconfidence, could be construed as a clear-headed plan. I'd leave it to future situations to tell us. Let's keep in mind and let's watch the situation to figure out what exactly is going to unfold. Today, there are certain doubts that are coming across within the Europeans, and I said about that loan that the Europeans have kind of held up. The doubt talks about Ukrainian ability to stop Russia and restore its economy, and this was reported by the Bloomberg, again one of the very reputable reporting agencies in the European Union. The USA, on its part, requested Russia to recognize all American mercenaries detained in Donbass as combatants and give them the treatment as accorded by the Geneva Convention. This comes on the back of 3 mercenaries, foreign fighters, as you would like to call them, being awarded the death penalty by the Supreme Court of the DPR. The conflict in Ukraine is now slow and steady, splitting the American society as well. There are a certain number of Americans today talking about the stoppage of free flow of funds, which has been going across to Ukraine, especially amongst the Republican circles. The reaction to these billion-dollar trenches to Kiev is so different within various different segments of the United States, wherein some segments are now saying that it would be better to spend this money in solving the problems within the states, especially with regards to the shortages and the inflation that the United States is facing. Meanwhile, there's a fresh round of talks which is taking place between Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, and the United Nations to ensure grain exports from Ukraine would take place. And this is probably the first time after the Istanbul negotiations that the Russian and Ukrainian side have officially come together to talk about a particular subject. One of the things is reported is that President Erdogan is playing a pretty serious role in terms of continuing his negotiations or continuing his arbitration between both the countries to try and bring a resolve or bring some sort of a stop to the fighting within this particular country. It's been a bad time. For the people of that entire place, we see we see really bad reports coming out with regards to the human suffering in that region. And to end this particular video, I would just like to say, I hope some sense prevails in both the sides. They sit down, they talk about these things, and they try and resolve their differences in any other way apart from military ways. As far as the military way is concerned, the Russians are chugging along and taking cities day by day. Considering that this is the last phase of the Donbass war, there is speculation rife amongst many circles with regards what the next Russian target will be. That's all for me for now. Thank you so much for watching. I'd like to request you right here to subscribe to my channel, share my videos with your friends, like my videos, comment on them. It'll be really nice. And I'd like to thank many people who are regular commenters on my videos and some very, very insightful comments, which help me actually to plan my next talks as well. I'd like you to request you right here. If you want to support Dev Talks, please click on the thanks button just below this particular video. Help me out in producing more and more just for you. Till next time for another subject, Jai Hind.